Welcome to my channel Limelight Leaks. Please share and subscribe and hit the bell icon for new updates. They asked me to do it and I was excited to do some live shows. You know, I haven't. It's been a long time since I've been on stage in front of people. They said Elvis never had people who hated him. They were wrong. Behind the shiny jumpsuits and smooth charm, the king of rock and roll held deep anger and he wasn't afraid to let it out behind closed doors. While his public face stayed perfectly clean, those closest to Elvis knew there was a secret list, a bad list, a group of names that either stole his spotlight, broke his trust, or simply stood for everything he hated about the music business. Some were competitors, some were famous stars, some were friends who became enemies. And now, after many years of wondering, we show you the 7 musicians Elvis Presley secretly hated and the shocking reasons why. But be warned, by the end of this video, you might never see the king or these stars the same way again. The Beatles, they took his crown. When 4 young guys from Liverpool came to America, Elvis didn't clap. He made his jaw tight. To the rest of the world, the Beatles were fresh, new, and really charming. But to Elvis Presley, they were something else completely. A danger. Not just to his record sales, but to his fame. Almost overnight, they turned the spotlight away from them, king of rock and roll, and onto a new British invasion, one he hadn't seen coming. What hurt most was their power. These weren't just musicians, they were cultural rebels. Their messy hair, relaxed attitudes, and loud opinions went against everything Elvis's carefully perfect image stood for. Even worse, they weren't respectful. They didn't bow to the king. They competed with him. Elvis had fought hard to bring rock music to mainstream respectability. He'd survived attacks from politicians, church leaders, and old-fashioned critics who called him dirty. Now, here came 4 smart-mouthed Brits riding the wave he started and changing the rules as they went. In 1965, Elvis agreed to meet the Fab Four at Athos Bel Air mansion. It should have been a historic meeting of giants. Instead, it felt awkward, stiff, almost fake. According to insiders, Elvis barely looked at them. He played a bass while they nervously tried to make conversation. And after they left, he reportedly made fun of their haircuts, their manners, and their love of fame. Later, he took his complaints even higher, straight to the Oval Office. In a now famous 1970 meeting with President Richard Nixon, Elvis warned that the Beatles were troublemakers. He said they stirred up problems, encouraged drug use, and made Americans question their country. Elvis didn't just dislike them. He feared what they stood for. He saw them as rebels, radicals, and competitors. But one Beatle in particular would become Elvis's personal enemy, and his name, it was Lennon. John Lennon, the one he wanted watched. Oh, for all the Beatles, John Lennon drew Elvis's deepest anger. It wasn't just his music. It was everything Lennon stood for. Loud, rebellious, disrespectful. Elvis, who had built his image on Southern charm, religious hints, and military service, found Lennon's rebellion not only offensive, but downright dangerous. Lennon didn't hold back. He openly criticized the Vietnam War, made fun of organized religion, and once said the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, a comment that sent shock waves through the American South. To Elvis, that wasn't just rude. It was awful. His own career had been built on appealing to both religious fans and patriotic hearts. Lennon was ruining that balance with every quote. By the late 1960s, Lennon wasn't just a rock star. He was a political force. He appeared at rallies, marched with radicals, and used his platform to stir up worldwide controversy. His bed-ins for peace with Yoko Ono became media circuses. And Elvis, watching all this happen from his increasingly lonely Graceland world, was furious. He didn't understand how someone so privileged could publicly trash the very system that allowed him to succeed. According to multiple stories from Elvis's inner circle, including bodyguards Sonny and Red West, he believed Lennon was poisoning the minds of American youth. During his 1970 visit to the White House, Elvis handed a handwritten letter to President Nixon asking to be made a federal agent at large in the fight against drug culture and anti-American feelings. In that meeting, he specifically named John Lennon as a threat to national security, and he wasn't being dramatic. Elvis genuinely thought Lennon's influence was dangerous, that he was tearing down everything Elvis had worked to protect. Some even say he pushed for Lennon's deportation. What started as artistic rivalry had grown into full-blown political paranoia. But the next artist in Elvis's list wasn't a threat to America. He was a threat to Elvis's voice. Bob Dylan, the nasal voice Elvis couldn't stand. Bob Dylan was a poet, a prophet, a cultural force. But to Elvis Presley, he was just a guy who sang through his nose. While Elvis admired Dylan's deep lyrics, so much so that they recorded a haunting version of Tomorrow is a Long Time. He was completely confused by the delivery. Dylan's scratchy nasal vocals and conversational wandering phrasing didn't match with Elvis's own philosophy of performance. Elvis believed that a song should soar, that the voice should glide with precision and emotional skill. To him, Dylan sounded like he was mumbling in a rainstorm with a harmonica for punctuation. According to close friends, Elvis would sometimes make fun of Dylan's voice behind closed doors. One longtime member of his group recalled him rolling his eyes, turning the radio off mid-song and saying, "What the hell is he saying? Is this a joke?" He didn't buy into the folk hero worship or the poet with a guitar mystery. To Elvis, it all felt like smoke and mirrors, but his frustration wasn't just about the sound. It was about what Dylan represented. Dylan brought in a new kind of stardom. Unglamorous, brainy, politically charged. He didn't dress up. He didn't dance. He didn't smile for the cameras. And yet millions loved him. That stripped-down realness, the emphasis on raw message over polished performance, went against everything Elvis had spent years perfecting. With every Dylan hit, Elvis saw a changing tide. The industry was moving toward realism, protest, and social commentary. Gone were the days of stage sparkle and smooth love ballads. In their place came gritty lyrics, talk singing, and a new definition of cool that no longer included the king. Dylan became the voice of a movement. And Elvis, he began to feel like a museum piece. Still, he could laugh Dylan off, just another weirdo in a rapidly changing industry. But Dylan wasn't the only musical maverick who bothered Elvis. Another rocker got under his skin in a much more dangerous way. Jerry Lee Lewis, the wild one at the gate. They were both Southern boys with fire in their fingers, but Elvis never trusted Jerry Lee Lewis. At first glance, they were cut from the same cloth. Both poor Southern kids who grew up with gospel in their veins and lightning in their hands. They mixed the sacred with the dirty, built empires on hip-thrusting energy, and turned churches into concert halls. But beneath that shared beginning was a basic difference in control. Elvis, for all his swagger, knew how to play the game. He cleaned up his act in public, obeyed Colonel Parker's tight leash, and kept a polished image. Jerry Lee Lewis, on the other hand, didn't care. He tore through every line of decency like a man possessed. He married his 13-year-old cousin and defended it on national television. He drank booze like water, picked fights, and lit his own pianos on fire just to make a point. To Elvis, who had spent years battling critics and censors just to be taken seriously, Jerry wasn't just reckless. He was radioactive. The tension simmered, for years, occasionally hidden by Southern charm and fake smiles on shared stages. But the dam finally broke in 1976. That year, Jerry Lee showed up at Graceland in the middle of the night, drunk with a loaded gun on the dashboard. He crashed into the gates and demanded to see Elvis, yelling that he needed to talk to the king. Security swarmed in and had him arrested on the spot. Elvis was visibly shaken. Thestery went national, and for the first time, fans saw the chaos lurking behind the myth. Privately, Elvis said he's a threat to himself and everybody around him. What began as professional rivalry had turned into deep unease. Elvis no longer saw Jerry as a peer. He saw him as a powder keg ready to blow. What once was friendly competition had turned into full-blown paranoia. But then X-Man on Elvis's hate list didn't need to crash his gates. He had already insulted rock and roll itself. Frank Sinatra, the crooner who mocked the king. Long before Elvis wore sequins, Sinatra wore suits, and he hated rock and roll. To Frank Sinatra, the rise of guitar, slinging hip-thrusting rebels was the death knell of musical sophistication. He didn't hold back his words. In the 1950s, he famously condemned rock music as the most brutal, ugly, desperate, vicious form of expression. It wasn't a critique. It was a declaration of war. And for Elvis Presley, who was just beginning to carve out his place in music history, it hit like a slap across the face. Here was the reigning king of traditional pop, a man whose voice was pure velvet and whose fan base stretched from ballrooms to boardrooms, publicly dismissing everything Elvis was building. The insult wasn't just professional, it was generational. Sinatra's words drew a line in the sand. You were either part of the old guard or one of the noisy kids breaking the rules. And Elvis, with his gospel background and dreams of crossover success, found himself being painted as a vulgar outsider. In 1960, the two icons appeared side by side on the Frank Sinatra Timex show. On camera, they smiled, shook hands, and played the part. But according to members of Elvis's group, it was all a carefully staged performance. Behind the scenes, Elvis felt nothing but coldness. He reportedly called Sinatra Old Vegas, a man unwilling to accept that youth, rebellion, and raw emotion were the new face of American music. To Elvis, Sinatra represented the very thing he had fought against: snobbiness, stiffness, and the belief that rock and roll was just a phase. He didn't just disagree with Sinatra's opinion, he hated it, because no matter how successful Elvis became, those early wounds never fully healed. They shared a stage, they even shared fans, but they never shared respect. Still, their rivalry remained mostly civil. Two icons from different eras brushing shoulders, but never truly clashing. But the next figure in Elvis's life wasn't just dismissive or disrespectful. He held the reins to Elvis's entire existence, and never let go. Colonel Tom Parker, the puppet master. He wasn't a rival. He wasn't a musician. He was worse. Colonel Tom Parker wasn't just Elvis Presley's manager. He was the architect of his fame and the jailer of his freedom. To the public, Parker was the mastermind behind the king's meteoric rise. But behind the curtain, he was something much darker. A manipulator with a chokehold on Elvis's life, finances, and future. Elvis almost never criticized Parker in public. Their relationship was built on appearances, contracts, deals, and forced loyalty. But those closest to Elvis knew the truth. He grew to hate Parker deeply. The Colonel controlled everything: the endless parade of cheesy movies, the exhausting tours, the missed opportunities. When Elvis wanted to travel overseas to perform for global fans, Parker refused because he himself didn't have a valid passport. Parker also took a huge 50% cut of Elvis's earnings, far more than a standard manager. Even as Elvis's health got worse, Parker pushed him to perform, shoving him back on stage like a show pony just to pay off his own gambling debts. By the 1970s, Elvis was visibly falling apart, bloated, medicated, and emotionally spent. He was trapped in a golden cage built by the man who claimed to love him most. And though Elvis never openly rebelled, insiders say he blamed Parker for the prison his career became. And yet there was one last name. Not a manager, not a Beatle. A shadowy figure Elvis, never mentioned in public but allegedly despised in secret. Imitators, the ones who tried to be him. By the mid-70s, a strange and unsettling phenomenon had taken over Las Vegas. Elvis impersonators. They were everywhere. Lounges, weddings, tourist traps. Some were decent, most were dreadful. Bad suits, plastic wigs, exaggerated sneers, and sloppy renditions of Suspicious Minds blared from hotel bars like parodies of a man still very much alive. And Elvis hated it. To the public they were seen as tributes, light-hearted homages to a cultural legend. But to Elvis, they felt like slow-motion assassination attempts on his identity. He once told a close friend, "They're burying me before I'm dead." It wasn't just about bad impressions, it was about erosion. These acts turned his life's work into a gimmick. The swagger, the passion, the pain he poured into every song was being reduced to novelty, a costume, a punchline. He'd walk past casino posters and see caricatures of himself. Bloated, cartoonish, absurd. He reportedly skipped hotels altogether just to avoid glimpsing the mockery. Behind closed doors, he grew increasingly paranoid, wondering how he could still be alive and already feel forgotten. Worse still, the impersonators weren't going away. As Elvis's health and confidence declined, the copies multiplied. With every fake Elvis that hit the stage, the real one felt a little more invisible. He started to see them not as fans, but as ghosts, foretelling his obsolescence. A world that once worshipped him was now imitating him. And perhaps worst of all, for the first time in his life, Elvis couldn't stop it. They called him the king of rock and roll. But even kings have enemies. Behind the curtain, Elvis Presley wrestled with fame, betrayal, and a changing world that didn't always love him back. The voices he hated weren't always loud. Sometimes they were quiet. Sometimes they were reflections of himself. So the next time you hear a Beatles song, a Dylan lyric, or a shaky Elvis impression in a Vegas lounge, remember this: the king heard it too, and he never forgot.